The flight attendant thought humiliating the quiet woman in seat 2A would earn her admiration from the wealthy passengers around her. But before that plane touched the ground in Seattle, her entire career would collapse in front of everyone watching. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The private terminal at JFK Airport glowed beneath soft golden lighting as luxury travelers moved across polished marble floors, pulling designer luggage and speaking in hushed, confident voices. Expensive perfume drifted through the crowded boarding area, while digital screens flashed the words "First-Class Priority Boarding." Vivian Holloway stepped quietly through the terminal wearing a cream-colored sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers slightly worn from travel. A simple leather tote rested on her shoulder, the kind most people would overlook in a room filled with luxury brands and tailored suits. At 38, Vivian carried herself with calm confidence, but nothing about her appearance suggested the level of influence she actually possessed. She moved without hurry, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had long ago stopped caring what strangers thought of her. Near the boarding gate, Melissa Grant adjusted the silk scarf around her airline uniform and scanned the incoming passengers with practiced precision. At 32, Melissa had mastered the polished smile expected from senior first-class crew members, but beneath her professionalism lived something sharper, a quiet obsession with status. She could identify millionaires by their watches, old money by their shoes, and in her mind, the woman approaching the gate did not belong anywhere near the luxury cabin. Melissa's eyes traveled slowly over Vivian's outfit before settling on the boarding pass in her hand. "Ma'am," she said, forcing a tight smile. "Economy boarding starts in about 20 minutes. Several nearby passengers glanced over immediately. Vivian looked down at her boarding pass and replied gently, "I'm actually in first class." Melissa gave a soft laugh that barely concealed her disbelief. "Right." A gray-haired businessman standing nearby smirked behind his newspaper while another passenger exchanged amused looks with his wife. The atmosphere shifted subtly, the way crowded spaces do when people sense embarrassment approaching. Vivian handed over her boarding pass without argument. Melissa scanned it, and for the briefest moment, surprise flickered across her face when the screen confirmed seat 2A. But the surprise disappeared almost instantly, replaced by suspicion. "Interesting," Melissa said slowly. "There must have been some kind of upgrade issue." Vivian remained calm. "I booked it 3 weeks ago." Melissa tilted her head slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound condescending rather than openly rude. First-class passengers usually travel with more appropriate attire for business routes like this. A few people nearby chuckled quietly. Vivian could feel the eyes on her now, studying her sweater, her tote bag, her simple appearance. But she didn't react. She simply stood there with both hands resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on suitcase. The silence seemed to irritate Melissa even more. "Well," the flight attendant finally said while handing the boarding pass back, "I suppose we'll get this sorted out once you're on board." Then Melissa leaned closer and added with a smile cold enough to cut through the noise of the terminal, "Assuming there hasn't been a mistake." Melissa stepped aside with theatrical politeness, extending one arm toward the jet bridge while several passengers continued watching the exchange with open curiosity. Vivian thanked her quietly and walked forward, the wheels of her carry-on suitcase clicking softly against the polished floor. Behind her, she could still hear faint whispers drifting through the boarding area. Probably used points. Maybe somebody gave her the ticket. No way she paid 10 grand for that seat. Vivian said nothing. Years earlier, comments like those would have embarrassed her. Now they only reminded her how quickly people revealed themselves when they believed someone lacked status. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed beneath warm recessed lighting. Cream leather seats stretched across the spacious rows while flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle offering champagne in crystal glasses. The scent of fresh coffee and expensive cologne filled the quiet cabin. Vivian reached seat 2A near the front window and placed her tote carefully beneath the seat in front of her. Across the aisle, A sharply dressed woman in diamond earrings glanced at Vivian's outfit before subtly turning away with visible disapproval. Melissa appeared moments later holding a tablet against her chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Before departure, I need to verify your boarding credentials one more time." Several heads immediately turned. Vivian looked up calmly. "You already scanned my pass at the gate." Melissa maintained her frozen smile. "This is simply procedure when there are irregularities attached to premium seating." The word irregularities hung in the air like smoke. A man seated behind Vivian lowered his newspaper slightly, listening now with obvious interest. Vivian handed over her identification without argument. Melissa examined it carefully, almost hoping to discover something suspicious. "Vivian Holloway," she read slowly. "And you are traveling alone today?" "Yes." Melissa glanced at the worn leather tote again. "Business or leisure?" Vivian's eyes remained steady. "Business." A quiet chuckle escaped from somewhere behind them. Melissa handed the identification back with visible reluctance. "Well, there appears to be no technical issue," she admitted, though disappointment flickered across her face. Then she leaned slightly closer. "Still, first class tends to maintain certain expectations regarding presentation and conduct." Vivian looked directly at her for the first time. "Are you suggesting I do not belong here?" Melissa's expression tightened. "I am suggesting that our premium passengers value comfort and consistency." Across the aisle, the woman with diamond earrings nodded faintly in agreement. The tension in the cabin deepened. One younger flight attendant named Rachel Bennett stood frozen near the galley holding a tray of drinks. At 24, Rachel had only worked international routes for 6 months, but even she could feel the discomfort spreading through the cabin. She watched Vivian carefully and saw something that unsettled her. The woman was not defensive. She was not intimidated. She simply looked tired, like someone who had dealt with this kind of judgment far too many times before. Rachel opened her mouth slightly, as if considering stepping in, but Melissa spoke again before she could gather the courage. "Perhaps we can avoid confusion entirely," Melissa said brightly. "Would you mind showing proof of your original purchase confirmation?" The cabin fell silent. Even passengers pretending not to watch were now openly listening. Vivian blinked once, surprised by the request. "You want proof that I paid for my seat?" Melissa folded her arms lightly. It would help reassure everyone that there was not some unfortunate boarding mistake. Rachel's face paled. A businessman near row 3 exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his wife, but nobody spoke. Vivian slowly reached into her tote bag and removed her phone while dozens of eyes remained fixed on her. Then Melissa delivered the sentence that pushed the humiliation even further. "Please stand while we verify the information, ma'am. We do not want departure delayed because of a seating issue." Vivian slowly rose from her seat as the first-class cabin watched in complete silence. The soft hum of the aircraft ventilation seemed louder now, filling the uncomfortable stillness spreading across the rows. Melissa stood with her tablet pressed tightly against her chest, her posture rigid with confidence, while Rachel remained frozen several feet away beside the beverage cart, gripping a tray so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Vivian unlocked her phone calmly and opened her email confirmation without visible frustration. "Here is the original purchase receipt," she said softly. Melissa barely glanced at the screen before replying. "I will need to verify it personally." Her tone carried the sharp satisfaction of someone enjoying authority in front of an audience. A man seated near the aisle muttered under his breath, "This is getting embarrassing." His wife whispered back, "If she paid for the seat, they should leave her alone." But neither of them spoke loudly enough to challenge Melissa directly. That was the nature of public humiliation. Most people recognized injustice long before they found the courage to interrupt it. Melissa studied the confirmation with exaggerated slowness. "Interesting," she finally said. "A corporate account purchase." Vivian nodded once. "That is correct." Melissa tilted her head. "And which company exactly authorized this?" Vivian hesitated briefly before answering. "Holloway Aerotech." The name landed softly in the air, but something unusual happened the moment Rachel heard it. Her eyes widened slightly. She had seen that name before during a mandatory corporate briefing about major airline investors and technology partners. Holloway Aerotech was not a small company. It was one of the largest aviation software firms in North America, valued in the billions. Rachel looked quickly toward Melissa, expecting her reaction to change. But Melissa either did not recognize the name or chose not to care. Instead, she gave a short dismissive smile. "I see." Then she handed the phone back as if the information meant nothing. Vivian returned quietly to her seat, but Melissa did not move away. The older businessman behind them leaned forward curiously. "Aerotech?" he asked. "You work there?" Vivian looked toward him politely. "Something like that." The man nodded slowly, though his doubtful expression made it clear he did not believe her. Melissa crossed her arms lightly. "Well, regardless of employment, first class also requires a certain atmosphere." Rachel finally spoke, her voice cautious. "Melissa, I think everything checks out." Melissa shot her a cold glance sharp enough to silence her immediately. "Thank you, Rachel. I can handle my cabin." Rachel lowered her eyes at once. The room fell quiet again. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage crews moved beneath flashing runway lights while the sky darkened into deep blue evening. Inside the cabin, however, the tension kept tightening. Vivian sensed it in every lingering stare and whispered conversation. She had experienced rooms like this her entire life. Rooms where people decided your value before you finished introducing yourself. Melissa suddenly noticed a small silver card partially visible inside Vivian's tote bag when the zipper shifted open. The card carried an embossed logo shaped like a wing. Melissa reached toward it instinctively. "What is that?" Vivian gently pulled the bag closer. "Just a business card." But Melissa had already seen enough to catch the name beneath the silver emblem. Holloway Aerotech Executive Board. For the briefest second, uncertainty crossed her face. Then it disappeared beneath pride. She straightened immediately, as if refusing to let doubt interfere with the role she had already committed to playing. Around them, passengers watched more openly now, sensing something unusual unfolding. Even the businessman who had mocked Vivian earlier lowered his newspaper completely. Melissa inhaled slowly before speaking again, louder this time, so the surrounding rows could hear every word clearly. "Since there seems to be ongoing confusion regarding your status aboard this flight, I believe the most professional solution is to involve the captain before departure." The cabin went still. Rachel's eyes widened in alarm, while Vivian looked up calmly from her seat. Melissa pressed the intercom button beside the galley wall and delivered the sentence that made several passengers visibly uncomfortable. "Captain Cole, we may have an unauthorized first-class passenger on board. Assistance requested immediately." The intercom clicked off, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to spread through the first-class cabin row by row. Several passengers exchanged uneasy looks while others leaned farther into the aisle, openly invested now in the unfolding humiliation. Rachel stood near the galley with visible anxiety written across her face, but Melissa remained perfectly composed, smoothing the sleeve of her uniform as though she had just handled an ordinary inconvenience. Vivian sat quietly in seat 2A with both hands folded in her lap, her calmness almost unsettling against the growing tension surrounding her. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Ethan Cole stepped into the aisle. Tall, silver-haired, and sharply dressed in his Navy captain's uniform, he carried the quiet authority of a man used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. Conversation stopped immediately when passengers recognized him. Melissa approached him at once, lowering her voice just enough to appear professional while still ensuring nearby passengers could hear fragments of the conversation. "Possible boarding irregularity in first class," she explained carefully. "Documentation appears inconsistent with presentation." Captain Cole frowned slightly. "Presentation?" Melissa gestured subtly toward Vivian. Several concerns were raised before departure. Ethan's eyes moved toward Vivian for the first time. She stood slowly out of respect for his position, not because she felt guilty. The captain studied her expression carefully. There was no panic there, no defensiveness, only a quiet exhaustion that made the situation feel suddenly less certain than Melissa had presented it. "Ma'am," Ethan said calmly, "I understand there has been confusion regarding your seating assignment." Vivian nodded politely. "Apparently so." Melissa quickly stepped in again. "Captain, we are already delayed 8 minutes. Passengers are becoming uncomfortable, and there are concerns regarding whether this cabin environment remains appropriate." The word appropriate lingered in the air like poison. A woman near the window lowered her eyes awkwardly while the businessman behind Vivian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The atmosphere no longer felt entertaining. It felt cruel. Ethan looked toward Melissa. Did the boarding pass verify? Melissa hesitated for half a second too long. Technically, yes, but there are still questions. Rachel finally gathered enough courage to speak softly from behind them. Captain, I think maybe this has gone too far. Melissa turned sharply toward her junior attendant. Rachel, please return to your station. Rachel fell silent immediately. Ethan exhaled slowly, clearly aware now that the situation had spiraled beyond normal procedure. Still, the pressure of a delayed departure and dozens of watching passengers weighed visibly on him. He turned back toward Vivian with measured professionalism. Ma'am, perhaps the easiest solution would be to relocate you temporarily while we sort this out after takeoff. The cabin became completely still. Even Melissa seemed satisfied hearing the words spoken aloud by the captain himself. Vivian looked at Ethan for several seconds before answering quietly. You are asking me to leave the seat I lawfully purchased because my presence makes people uncomfortable. No one responded. The silence itself became an answer. Vivian glanced slowly around the cabin. She saw passengers avoiding eye contact now. She saw Rachel standing frozen with guilt written across her face. She saw Melissa holding onto her authority like armor. Then Vivian gave a faint nod, as though accepting something far larger than a seating dispute. You know, she said softly, people often reveal their character most clearly when they believe someone has less power than they do. The room went silent. Melissa's jaw tightened instantly, while Ethan's expression shifted with visible discomfort. Vivian bent down calmly and lifted her worn leather tote from beneath the seat. The small silver executive card inside caught the cabin light briefly before disappearing back into the bag. She placed one hand gently on the headrest beside seat 2A and looked out the window toward the blinking runway lights beyond the glass. It is all right, she continued quietly. I learned a long time ago that dignity does not disappear simply because others fail to recognize it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For one suspended moment, the entire first-class cabin seemed trapped beneath the weight of her words. Then Vivian stepped slowly into the aisle with her carry-on suitcase rolling softly behind her while passengers watched in complete silence. And somewhere near the back of the cabin, Rachel Bennett lowered her head in shame as the aircraft door remained open beside the darkening New York sky. Vivian walked slowly up the jet bridge with her carry-on suitcase rolling behind her, the sound of its small wheels echoing softly against the narrow metal floor. Behind her, the first-class cabin remained frozen in uncomfortable silence, while passengers avoided looking directly at one another. The humiliation had stopped feeling entertaining long ago. Now it simply felt wrong. Outside the aircraft, the cool evening air from the terminal drifted faintly through the open boarding door as airport staff moved through the gate area under pale fluorescent lighting. Vivian stepped aside near the large terminal windows overlooking the runway and placed her tote gently on an empty chair. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Rachel Bennett appeared several seconds later, still wearing her flight attendant uniform, her face pale with guilt. She hesitated before approaching carefully. Ms. Holloway, she said softly, I am so sorry. Vivian opened her eyes and gave her a calm look. You do not need to apologize for someone else's choices. Rachel swallowed hard. I should have said more back there. Vivian studied the young woman for a moment, noticing the sincerity in her trembling voice. Rachel reminded her of herself years ago, uncertain, trying to survive in rooms filled with people who valued status more than kindness. Vivian offered a faint smile. Sometimes speaking up feels harder when everyone around you stays silent. Rachel lowered her eyes. It still was not right. Beyond the glass windows, runway lights stretched across the darkening airport like scattered gold beneath the night sky. The low roar of departing aircraft vibrated faintly through the terminal walls. Vivian rested one hand against her tote bag, where the silver executive card remained hidden inside. Her expression softened slightly as old memories surfaced. 22 years earlier, her father had stood beside her in a crowded airport almost exactly like this one. He had worked maintenance for a regional airline his entire life, often invisible to the wealthy travelers passing him by. Vivian still remembered the stain of grease on his work jacket and the exhaustion in his hands after double shifts. One afternoon, after watching a businessman insult a janitor in front of dozens of people, her father had quietly told her something she never forgot. Never measure people by what they wear, Vivi. The people who deserve respect usually ask for it the least. That sentence had shaped her entire life. Even after building Holloway Aerotech into one of the most influential aviation technology companies in the country, she refused private jets, refused bodyguards, refused the polished arrogance that often came with wealth. She traveled simply because she wanted to see how people treated ordinary strangers when they believed nobody important was watching. Rachel sat quietly beside her now, still visibly shaken. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. Vivian nodded. "Why did you stay so calm back there?" Vivian looked through the glass toward the aircraft where passengers were still boarding under the glowing gate lights. "Because anger would only make them feel justified," she answered softly. Rachel fell silent again. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Nearby, airport announcements echoed through the terminal while travelers rushed past carrying coffee cups and rolling luggage, completely unaware of the storm quietly building around Gate 14. Then Vivian's phone vibrated inside her tote bag. She glanced at the screen briefly. The caller ID displayed one name: Robert Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Skies Airlines. Rachel's eyes widened slightly when she accidentally caught sight of the screen. Before she could process what she had seen, Vivian declined the call without expression and slipped the phone back into her bag. But only seconds later, something changed in the atmosphere around them. Down the corridor beyond the gate entrance, hurried footsteps suddenly echoed across the terminal floor. Fast, sharp, urgent. Several airport employees turned their heads at once as two men in dark executive suits appeared near security, moving quickly toward Gate 14 while speaking anxiously into their phones. And the moment Melissa Grant noticed them through the aircraft doorway, the color drained slowly from her face. The atmosphere around Gate 14 shifted instantly the moment the two executives arrived. Conversations faded. Airport employees straightened their posture. Even passengers still seated inside the aircraft began noticing the sudden tension spreading through the terminal windows. The older of the two men moved quickly with the focused urgency of someone trying to stop a disaster before it became irreversible. His charcoal overcoat hung open over a tailored navy suit, and the silver hair at his temples only sharpened the authority in his expression. Robert Whitmore rarely appeared in terminals personally. As Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Skies Airlines, he usually operated from private boardrooms and executive towers far removed from crowded boarding gates. Yet now he was walking rapidly through JFK Airport with visible concern in his eyes. Beside him, Atlantic Skies Legal Director Nathan Keller held a tablet in one hand while speaking quietly into an earpiece. "Confirmed," Nathan whispered. It was Melissa Grant who filed the complaint. Robert's jaw tightened. "And Captain Cole authorized the removal?" Nathan nodded once. "Temporary reassignment, pending verification." Robert stopped walking for half a second, disbelief flashing across his face. Dear God. Inside the aircraft doorway, Melissa watched them approach and felt her stomach twist uncomfortably. At first, she assumed they were responding to a passenger complaint from some wealthy traveler in first class. But then she saw Robert Whitmore glance past the aircraft entirely, searching the terminal instead. Not the cabin, not the crew, someone else. Melissa suddenly remembered the silver executive card. Holloway Aerotech Executive Board. A cold realization began crawling slowly through her chest. Rachel noticed it too. She stood near the jet bridge in trance, unable to look away as Robert Whitmore approached Vivian directly. The powerful airline executive slowed the moment he reached her. His entire demeanor changed. "Ms. Holloway," he said carefully, almost breathless from hurrying through the terminal. "I am deeply sorry." The entire gate area fell silent. Nearby passengers froze mid-conversation. Melissa's face lost color completely. Vivian stood calmly beside the terminal window with one hand resting lightly on her tote bag. "Good evening, Robert," she replied softly. Robert Whitmore looked genuinely shaken. "I just learned what happened." Vivian gave a faint nod, but said nothing. Nathan Keller stepped forward quickly, his expression tense. "The board was informed 10 minutes ago when your office delayed tomorrow morning's contract signing." Several employees nearby exchanged confused looks. Contract signing? Robert turned toward the aircraft slowly. Through the open doorway, Melissa stood completely frozen beneath the cabin lights, while Captain Ethan Cole emerged behind her with visible concern spreading across his face. Robert's voice became colder now, controlled but unmistakably furious beneath the surface. "Do you have any idea who you asked to leave this aircraft?" Nobody answered. The silence itself became humiliating. Passengers near the doorway stared openly now, while whispers spread rapidly through the first-class cabin. Holloway Aerotech was not simply another corporate partner. It was the company responsible for the airline's next-generation navigation systems. The billion-dollar technology agreement Atlantic Skies had spent 2 years negotiating. And Vivian Holloway was not merely a board member. She was the founder. Melissa's breathing became shallow as memory after memory replayed violently in her head. The comments, the suspicion, the request to prove she belonged. Captain Cole removed his hat slowly, realization washing visibly across his face. Rachel lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had unfolded. But Vivian herself remained composed. No anger, no triumph, only disappointment. Robert Whitmore stepped closer to her, his voice quieter now. "Miss Holloway, Atlantic Skies values your partnership more than I can express." Vivian finally looked directly at him. Her expression remained calm, but there was something far heavier behind her eyes now. Years of watching people confuse simplicity with weakness. Years of seeing kindness mistaken for insignificance. The terminal had gone completely still around them. Then Vivian spoke one sentence so quietly that everyone strained to hear it. "The problem is not that your staff failed to recognize me, Robert. The problem is how comfortably they mistreated someone they believed was ordinary." The silence around Gate 14 deepened after Vivian's words, spreading through the terminal with the weight of collective shame. Passengers who had laughed earlier now stood motionless beside their luggage, avoiding eye contact as the reality of the situation settled over them. Inside the aircraft doorway, Melissa Grant looked as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. Captain Ethan Cole remained beside her, his face tense with regret, while airport staff quietly gathered nearby, pretending to work while listening to every word. Robert Whitmore straightened slowly and looked toward his employees with visible disappointment. "Is there anyone here who would like to explain exactly what happened?" he asked calmly. No one answered at first. Melissa's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The confidence that had once sharpened every sentence she spoke had vanished completely. Then Rachel Bennett stepped forward. Her hands trembled faintly, but her voice remained steady enough to carry through the silent gate area. "Ms. Holloway showed a valid boarding pass from the beginning," she said quietly. Melissa closed her eyes for a brief second. Rachel continued carefully. "There was never a technical issue with her ticket." Several nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. The businessman who had mocked Vivian earlier lowered his newspaper entirely now, his face pale with embarrassment. Rachel swallowed hard before adding the part that mattered most. The concern was based on how she looked. The words landed heavily across the terminal. Nobody could hide behind procedure anymore. Nobody could pretend this had been about airline policy. Melissa finally forced herself to speak, her voice strained and uneven. "I was trying to maintain standards for the first-class cabin." Vivian looked at her calmly. "By humiliating someone publicly?" Melissa's eyes dropped immediately. Robert Whitmore rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead, clearly fighting anger. "Melissa," he said quietly, "do you understand who Miss Holloway is?" Melissa nodded weakly without looking up. But Vivian interrupted before Robert could continue. "No," she said softly. "That is exactly the point. She did not know who I was." Everyone fell silent again. Vivian stepped closer, her expression composed but firm. "If kindness only exists for powerful people, then it is not kindness at all." Rachel's eyes filled slightly as she listened. Around them, the atmosphere had changed completely. The woman who had once been treated like an inconvenience now commanded the attention of every person in the terminal without raising her voice. Nathan Keller glanced toward Vivian with visible admiration. "Most people do not realize this," he said carefully to the surrounding staff. "But Holloway Aerotech funded over 600 aviation scholarships in the last 5 years." Several airline employees looked stunned. Nathan continued, including training grants for flight attendants entering the industry. Rachel blinked in surprise. Melissa slowly looked up, confusion spreading across her face. Nathan opened the tablet in his hands and spoke more quietly now. Your own scholarship application was partially funded through the Holloway Foundation 3 years ago. Melissa froze completely. The color drained from her face again as the memory hit her all at once. The acceptance letter. The anonymous donor program that helped her finish certification after her father lost his job during the pandemic. Her breathing became shallow. No, she whispered faintly. Nathan turned the tablet slightly toward her. Yes. Melissa stared at the screen in disbelief while the truth unfolded in front of everyone watching. The woman she had publicly humiliated was the same woman whose foundation had quietly helped launch her career. A hush fell across the terminal. Vivian noticed the devastation in Melissa's expression and spoke before Robert Whitmore could respond further. Do not destroy her life over one terrible mistake, she said softly. Robert looked genuinely surprised. Ms. Holloway, after what happened tonight, Vivian shook her head gently. People learn more from accountability than humiliation. Those words seemed to hit the room even harder than the revelation itself. Melissa's eyes filled with tears she clearly fought to hide, while Rachel stood frozen beside her. Captain Cole removed his hat respectfully and lowered his head slightly toward Vivian. Across the gate area, passengers who once looked down on her now watched with something entirely different in their eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. And for the first time that entire evening, nobody in the terminal saw Vivian Holloway as an ordinary woman in a simple sweater. They saw exactly what dignity looked like. The terminal remained unusually quiet even after boarding resumed. Passengers moved more slowly now, speaking in lowered voices as if something larger than a delayed flight had unfolded in front of them. The polished floors of Gate 14 no longer felt like the stage for public humiliation. They felt like a place where people had just witnessed a hard truth about themselves. Robert Whitmore stood beside Vivian near the terminal windows while Nathan Keller quietly coordinated with airline operations several feet away. Captain Ethan Cole had personally postponed departure another 20 minutes, insisting the crew reset the cabin before takeoff. Melissa Grant remained near the aircraft doorway with her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform, no longer trying to defend herself, no longer able to avoid the weight of what had happened. Robert finally broke the silence. Melissa Grant is being removed from active duty pending formal review, he said carefully. Captain Cole will also submit a full report regarding tonight's incident. Vivian nodded once, but said nothing immediately. She understood consequences mattered. Systems did not improve through silence. But humiliation for humiliation had never interested her. What happens after the review? She asked quietly. Robert hesitated. Mandatory retraining at minimum. Possible reassignment. Vivian looked toward Melissa for a long moment before answering. Then make sure the retraining actually teaches something. Robert frowned slightly. Vivian continued softly. Most corporations focus on customer service scripts. They should focus on human dignity. Nearby employees listened carefully now. Rachel Bennett stood close enough to hear every word. People should not need expensive clothing to receive basic respect, Vivian said. And your employees should not feel pressured to judge worth by appearance. Robert slowly nodded. You are right. Nathan stepped closer with the tablet still in his hand. The board will support any reforms you recommend. Vivian looked surprised for a brief second, then thoughtful. She glanced around the terminal at the airline staff moving nervously beneath the bright overhead lights. Baggage workers, gate agents, junior attendants, most of them exhausted. Most of them invisible to the passengers rushing past them every day. Then start here, Vivian said calmly. Expand scholarship access for aviation workers. Mental health support too. Better leadership training. Teach people that professionalism and compassion are not opposites. Rachel blinked in surprise. You would still want to help after tonight? Vivian gave her a faint smile. Pain only becomes useful if it improves something. The words settled quietly over everyone listening. Robert Whitmore extended his hand respectfully toward Vivian. Atlantic Skies would be honored to partner with the Holloway Foundation on those changes. Vivian shook his hand once, simple and dignified. Across the gate area, several passengers who had watched the humiliation unfold earlier now looked openly ashamed. The businessman with the newspaper approached slowly, removing his glasses as he stopped near Vivian. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Vivian nodded politely. "Thank you." He lowered his eyes. "I should have spoken sooner." "Most people should," Vivian replied gently, not cruelly. The man gave a small, embarrassed nod before walking away. Meanwhile, Melissa still stood motionless near the aircraft entrance, listening to every conversation as realization slowly settled deeper inside her. The humiliation she felt now was not caused by punishment. It came from understanding. Understanding that the woman she dismissed had shown her more grace in 1 hour than she herself had shown all evening. Rachel slowly approached Melissa beside the doorway. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Melissa whispered quietly, "She could have destroyed my career." Rachel looked toward Vivian across the terminal, but she did not. Melissa swallowed hard as tears gathered again in her eyes. She remembered her own father standing in old work uniforms after long shifts, exhausted and overlooked by strangers who believed status defined value. Somewhere along the way, she had become the kind of person he warned her never to become. Through the terminal glass, runway lights shimmered against the dark night, while aircraft engines rumbled softly in the distance. Melissa watched Vivian speaking kindly with airport employees who moments earlier had been too intimidated to approach her. No arrogance, no revenge, no performance, just dignity. And standing there beneath the bright gate lights, Melissa Grant finally understood the deepest lesson of all. The most powerful people in the room are often the ones who never need to prove it. An hour later, Flight 227 finally lifted into the dark New York sky beneath a blanket of scattered clouds and distant city lights. But the atmosphere inside the aircraft had completely changed. The first-class cabin that once carried whispers of judgment now rested in unusual silence, softened by reflection and quiet humility. Vivian Holloway sat once again in seat 2A, not because she demanded it, but because Captain Ethan Cole personally escorted her back on board after every passenger and crew member had been informed of the situation. This time, when she entered the cabin, people stood aside respectfully. Some nodded politely. Others quietly apologized as she passed. The businessman who once smirked behind his newspaper rose from his seat and offered her the aisle without a word. Vivian acknowledged him with a small, grateful smile and sat calmly beside the window while the aircraft climbed steadily above the glowing coastline below. Rachel Bennett approached carefully several minutes later carrying a tray with tea instead of champagne. "Chamomile," she said softly. "I remembered you mentioned long flights make it difficult to sleep." Vivian looked up with gentle surprise. "Thank you, Rachel." Rachel smiled nervously. "Captain Cole also asked me to let you know that Atlantic Skies would like to offer you a permanent advisory role in the new hospitality reform program." Vivian glanced toward the cockpit door thoughtfully. "And what about you?" Rachel blinked. "Me?" Vivian nodded once. "People who speak up when it matters should not remain invisible." Rachel's eyes widened slightly as Vivian reached into her tote and removed a small business card. Not silver this time. White and simple. Holloway Foundation Leadership Fellowship. "If you are interested," Vivian said quietly, "my foundation sponsors future aviation leaders focused on ethical service and employee advocacy." Rachel stared at the card in disbelief. "You would really do that for me?" Vivian smiled faintly. "Kindness should move forward, not stop with us." Rachel's eyes filled again, but this time with gratitude instead of shame. Across the cabin, several passengers pretended not to listen while secretly absorbing every word. Near the rear galley, Melissa Grant stood quietly waiting for the final paperwork before leaving the aircraft permanently for administrative review. Her uniform still looked polished, but something in her expression had changed completely. The sharp arrogance was gone now, replaced by painful honesty. Before deplaning during the Seattle stopover, Melissa slowly approached seat 2A with visible hesitation. The entire cabin seemed to notice immediately. Vivian looked up calmly as Melissa stopped beside her chair. For several seconds, Melissa could not speak. Then finally, with trembling composure, she said the words she should have spoken hours earlier. "I am deeply sorry, Miss Holloway." Vivian listened silently. Melissa swallowed hard before continuing. "Not because of who you are, because of how I treated you when I thought you were nobody important." The cabin remained perfectly still. Vivian saw no excuses in Melissa's eyes now. No self-pity. Only regret. Thank you for saying that honestly, Vivian replied softly. Melissa lowered her gaze. I forgot what respect was supposed to look like. Vivian studied her for a moment before answering gently. Then remember this feeling the next time someone walks onto a plane wearing ordinary clothes. Melissa nodded once, tears forming quietly as she stepped away without another word. There was no dramatic punishment, no public destruction, only accountability and a lesson that would likely stay with her far longer than humiliation ever could. Hours later, as the aircraft descended toward Seattle beneath pale morning light, Vivian rested her head lightly against the window and watched the mountains emerge through the clouds. Her phone buzzed softly with a message from her father. Proud of you, Vivi. She smiled to herself and slipped the phone back into her bag while the cabin around her remained calm and thoughtful in the soft glow of sunrise. And that morning, everyone aboard Flight 227 remembered that dignity does not announce itself through wealth, titles, or appearance. It quietly reveals itself in how we choose to treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us.